Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Happiness Index podcast. My name is Matt Phelan. I am your host today. I'm co-founder of the Happiness Index, and today we're going to be talking about not engagement, but we're going to be talking about disengagement. We're going to be talking about the science of disengagement, and to help us to do this, I'm here with Siobhan, who I'm going to ask her to introduce herself. Hello, Siobhan. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, Matt. Thank you so much for having me on. So, I'm Dr. Siobhan Renshaw, still getting used to the whole doctor bit. I am an organisational psychologist with a doctorate in management, specifically employee disengagement. I'm an academic researcher and I spend time thinking about how employees experience their work and the workplace. And what I do with that is that I empower organisations to help them inform their approaches to employee disengagement.
Okay, so many questions on that, Siobhan. And by the way, on the doctor thing, as someone who's not a doctor, and as someone who's spoke to you before about how much work goes into being a doctor, you should definitely not feel funny about saying it. You should own it because it's incredible that you've done that. And in terms of your happiness, tell us about what makes Siobhan happy.
Oh, it has to be my allotment and my garden. They're very much my happy places. I grow my own fruit and veg and herbs, and I only grow fruit and veg and herbs. If I can't eat it, I'm not massively interested in growing it. For me, it's all about getting your hands dirty. There's nothing like creating the right conditions for those plants to thrive in and taking them through their life cycle, facilitating their germination and putting them out in the right conditions and giving them the support they need to flourish. And ultimately, of course, sharing them out with family and friends. It's just the best thing.
So, Siobhan, bringing it forward into your research or
Mm.
thesis, there is so much talk around things like engagement or disengagement being a productivity killer. What was the question you set out with your work to answer? Like, what was the starting point for you?
Yeah, so absolutely. That is the typical presentation of disengagement as an undesirable external behavior that's absolutely not conducive to productivity. Really, essentially, is the opposite to engagement. And that idea of them as opposites is intuitive, it's very relatable, and it's suggested by the very composition of the term itself, disengagement. And it can be traced right back to the seminal work of Kahn, who I know you've had on the show. He positioned engagement and disengagement at either end of a continuum. But the more you dig into the academic research, the more you find that idea of them as opposites is based largely on assumptions drawn from the more popular field of engagement. And that was Kahn's focus. And what he theorized about disengagement was based on that assumed opposing nature. So we interrogated those ideas and we went right back to square one. We conducted something of a sort of construct cleanup. We stripped it right back, removed all the surplus meanings and what are often quite unhelpful sort of associations. And we prepared the foundations for developing an understanding of what disengagement really is from the bottom up. And the question that guided that research was, how is disengagement understood and experienced?
So I think that leads us into that. That's a good, that was my next question around business leaders listening. Sometimes that disengagement can be a bit vague. Like they don't necessarily know, like, as you say, they see it as just the opposite of engagement. If you had a CEO here and they were just saying, could you just give me a definition of it? Is that, would you use that bit, Siobhan, or would you say?
Yeah, I think there's certainly vague and conflicting ideas out there as to what disengagement is. There's no consensual definition, even in the academic literature. You've got academics using terms like disengagement and burnout interchangeably. Others refer to it as low engagement or negative engagement or even unengagement.
Yeah.
And that's something that really permeates down to all the other levels of this construct. And I'll come back to that. But in a nutshell, there's two main schools of thought on disengagement, one of which stems from Kahn, positioning them as opposites, and the other hails from the burnout literature and the work of Phelan and Becker, who position it as a sub-construct of burnout. So we wanted to bring a bit of clarity to all this sort of chaos, really. And the ultimate gesture towards construct clarity is the offering of a definition. So, based on the findings of our research, we proposed a new definition derived from the data. We define disengagement as the emotionally laden, affective, and cognitive psychological experience of perceived vulnerability to one's personal self at work.
Okay, so if you met my 11-year-old daughter, how would you explain that to her?
Disengagement is something that we do when we feel vulnerable. Disengagement is something that we choose to do if we perceive that there's a threat to some important part of who we are. That's
Yeah.
disengagement.
Okay, I really like that explanation. The surprise, every bit of the research, every researcher that I've spoke to has a bit of an aha moment where they're like, oh, this is interesting. Think back to, you mentioned the episode with Bill Kahn. I think back to the episode with Jeremy Dawson talked about his aha moment in his NHS engagement study was link between discrimination and happiness. Alex Edmonds talked about he was really surprised there wasn't much of a difference in flow through of happiness to performance from sector to sector. They always thought it would be quite different, but found it quite similar. That's a couple of that we've had shared on here before, Siobhan. What was your one where you were like, oh, that's interesting?
Yeah, there certainly were a couple, but the one that sticks out right now for me is that as we went with participants through their experiences of disengagement during their interviews, they experienced something of an evolution of their understanding of it. So that whole lacking productivity and all the other behavioral associations that we typically attribute to disengagement, they were reminiscent of early presentations of it at the top of participants' interviews as to what the disengagement meant to them.
Okay.
At that point, they weren't like fully immersed in their lived experiences. And instead, they were responding just at the sort of surface level, and their responses were based on associations. But we navigated through their lived experiences and we went far beyond those initial surface meanings, and their ideas developed and their understanding of it advanced. So, one participant initially described it as, oh, disengagement is just, and I quote, going through the motions at work where you're just doing the bare minimum and you're not giving 100%. But it transpires that wasn't drawn from her own experience. Instead, she was talking just based on her associations of how she's observed disengagement in others. And in her closing reflections towards the end of her interview, she actually acknowledged that, in fact, disengagement doesn't necessarily have an obvious outward outcome. It can just be, and I quote, this is how I feel.
Yeah.
None of these things really cause me not to perform at work. The aha moment was that disengagement is not external, it's not behavioral. Disengagement was internal, it was deeply personal, and it was intrinsically linked to people's identities and to survival. And above all else, disengagement was highly emotive. And that's very much counterintuitive. It rails against the sort of common ideas of disengagement. And also, it throws into relief this central dynamic of the construct that current theory that's out there doesn't recognize. And the existing tools in use that people use on disengagement, it can't detect that affect in disengagement, and it can't measure it and it can't manage it.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I know you did only say one, but just briefly,
Yes, please.
it would be remiss really not to mention that disengagement, contrary to dominant presentations, isn't entirely negative. It's not entirely this undesirable thing that we've got to try and get rid of. Disengagement actually has positive function. Excuse me. There were advantages in people's disengagement, both for themselves and for the wider organization. So our data showed that disengagement can be this calculated, conscious, strategic response to trauma in order
Yeah.
to avoid more like triggering exposures. So employees disengage as a coping mechanism to protect themselves from what they feel vulnerable to. And in doing so, some resisted more permanent alternatives, such as just walking out the door and leaving the organization. So, in a nutshell, disengagement is emotionally laden. It's an emotionally laden construct, and it has positive utility as a coping mechanism.
Wow. We're only a few minutes in and we're learning a lot already. This is great. It's fun. If you're going on to the why, what did your research identify as the primary drivers or root causes of disengagement in the modern workplace?
Yeah, it's such an interesting and important question. So, our research was foundational research and it was focused on the central disengagement construct. So, it wasn't so much concerned with what came before that or what came after that. First, we had to establish what disengagement actually is, right, in this specific context. And we had to do that before we can start to consider things like antecedents and outcomes. But I did ask participants about what happened in the lead up to their disengagement, primarily for the contextual information that their responses gave us, which helped us to interpret the engagement sort of more widely. And there is a range of factors at play there, things like not feeling valued, to inadequate communications and inadequate control over your work, and also some factors of a sort of predominantly personal nature. Relationships were pretty important, and they were in Khan's work too. More than any other colleague, one's relationship with their manager was the most important in our research. But while we're acknowledging all of these factors, ultimately this engagement results from the interplay between that external environmental stimuli and one's perception of it, relevant to one's personal needs. So ultimately, it's the choice of the individual. Disengagement is one's own choosing. And I think your question speaks more to cause and effect, as does a lot of the research. But I'd encourage more of a focus on the bit in the middle, the individual, and the disengagement itself. So, yeah, it's of course a complex psychological construct and it requires a more nuanced approach and consideration in context, crucially, and on an individual basis.
So that brings me on then, Siobhan. If it's deeply personal, how does it actually manifest in a team? Because it must be, as you say, it's even harder to detect if it's so internal. But how does it actually manifest?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a couple of things going on in what you're asking me. The first one being the manifestations and also about detecting it and those early warning signs. The manifestations, they absolutely are personal, they're internal, they're affective, that is, and they're cognitive. Disengagement is characterized by this impeded sense of self, a profound sense of vulnerability in the individual and impaired cognitive connection to their work, where they begin to reason against it. One participant, for example, described how it manifested in their thoughts as, and I quote, more risk averse and less willing to put myself forward. They begin to feel that it's wise to fully invest in themselves, and their thoughts turn instead to introducing distance between themselves and their work. Those thoughts and feelings that make up the disengagement itself, they motivate certain behaviors that follow them, which are conducive to the provision of that distance. So that's the manifestations based on our findings. In terms of what managers look for, again, it's really important to recognize that disengagement is going to look different in different contexts. It's imperative that managers know their people and how they can best support them, because if they don't, they're likely to be entirely ignorant to what might be early warning signs and how they look in those individuals and within their team.
Was it?
But yeah, sorry.
Sorry, carry on. I did.
I was just going to say that it's really important that when we're thinking about warning for signs and things, there's something that comes before that. And I think managers need to make sure that they are catering to the sort of human needs of their people, meeting their human needs and making them feel like humans and not just as resources. If they're standing in that place of knowledge of their team, then they'll be better placed to understand what might elicit feelings of vulnerability in them and why might some of them feel the need to disengage. And when managers do suspect that there's disengagement within their team, they are better placed to start those constructive conversations if they can demonstrate some insight and empathy around the potential triggers and how their staff might be thinking and feeling.
That's fascinating, Siobhan. At the Happiness Index, we don't have a list of values. Our values is a statement of freedom to be human, which
Ah.
a description of, and it's built on all our data actually, but that's how we summarize the data. And a lot of people talking at the moment about hybrid, virtual, the office. Those people that are thinking about that at the moment, did you notice anything to do with work? We call it work style at the Happiness Index. There's different descriptions of it. But was there any connections between work style and disengagement, or anything that you can share, or none at all?
We don't really have details about hybrid and remote work in our data, so I can't really speak to that topic. And also, given those sort of fundamental inadequacies in the theories and approaches on engagement and disengagement, we can't even really draw from the research that's out there in this instance that does make suggestions here. Firstly, because of the divergence of thoughts as to what disengagement even is, that makes for pretty shaky foundations on which to make proposals about how it could be impacted by hybrid working and things. And secondly, because much of that research unquestioningly adopts a perspective of engagement and disengagement as opposites. Also, I found that in that research that's out there on hybrid working and remote working and disengagement, they lump together terms like low engagement and loneliness and fatigue and isolation as if they're tantamount to disengagement, when the reality is that though they probably do share some conceptual space with disengagement, they are nevertheless conceptually distinct from it. So yeah, it's a bit of a minefield.
Yeah. And you've mentioned leadership a couple of times, and like looking out for this and warning signs and so on. How much a role does direct leadership or management style play in causing disengagement, according to your findings?
Yeah, so a few points on this. In our data, first of all, of course, our immediate concern wasn't with examining the causes so much. We did ask about the lead up, as I said, but in the data, managers and leaders featured centrally in participants' perceptions of their disengagement experiences. And again, relationships with managers were central here. Managers were linked to disengagement when they were perceived to have failed to meet employees' support needs and failed to make them feel valued, and when they were perceived to have accepted various injustices in the workplace, which was a really interesting one, and also when they didn't provide adequate communication or afford them the autonomy that they wanted. Interestingly, there was a tendency early on for participants to frame their managers almost as direct causes of their disengagement.
Right.
Um, but when we dug deeper into those experiences, there were far more personal motivations, which they realized. And participants, of course, had agency in their over their disengagement, and that awareness grew as their understanding of it deepened. Again, I think it's probably worth repeating that our data shows that that capacity to disengage is our own. Managers or leaders can't ever make somebody disengage because it's our personal choice made at varying levels of consciousness from a place of vulnerability. But the bottom line is that managers have a huge impact on the conditions, of course they do, in which their people are expected to perform, and they can influence the environment in ways which absolutely promote various engagement and disengagement outcomes as per the individual's perceptions of those conditions.
That's why I think it's fascinating that you do the research that you do, and the fact that you also have an allotment, because when you were talking, that's what I was thinking about, which is when you're saying a manager can't have a direct impact on disengagement. I see that as the same as like a plant. You can't make a plant grow. There is not a gardener in the world that can make the plant grow, but they can be aware of the conditions like the soil, the light, and all of these things that could have an impact on it. So I find that fascinating, and I could do just a whole podcast on that bit. I'm going to have to move this on because I think even that bit is just that we could get into that. But I just want to touch on the business case. And the reason I want to touch on that, Siobhan, is a lot of people who come to our brunches, meetups, events, and I just hosted one today. They describe a business world at the moment, broadly speaking, as less kind, more commercial, less sympathetic. And they talk about things like, we can't do anything unless it's linked to the business case. And I think there's positive and negatives out of that. I think it actually makes more of a case for more science, more data to come into business, because businesses have been doing things for years that don't make sense. But it's hard, isn't it? You're not a scientist, you're not a doctor, you're a HR professional. You're trying to put these practices in place, which generally speaking, you think is going to improve the employee experience. There's a big push from CFOs to link the work to the business case and so on. In your work, did you find anything that links disengagement to business outcomes?
Yeah. So, of course, because we are focused on the sort of central disengagement construct and people's experiences of that, we don't have we don't have that in our data. There's lots of sort of future directions that I'd like to take this research in, and given the right funding, exploring the impact on business outcomes is absolutely a very worthy extension on this foundational research. But our current research says more about the personal impact. And given that business outcomes are ultimately determined, by at the individual sort of micro level, it's worth briefly mentioning, I think, some relevant insights there. So disengagement had both positive and negative personal and professional outcomes for individuals. And these were generally behavioral and conducive to the creation of that distance between the person and their work. Some were indeed productivity related, also interpersonal behaviors like altered styles of communication or social withdrawal. Managers tended to behave more emotionally, and some adopted antisocial interpersonal behaviors. But other managers reported self development and strategic gains from their disengagement. One recounted benefits specifically to their people management, saying, "I'm a better manager." But there were also reports of debilitating personal and professional impact, specifically on their people management. And that included proactively avoiding the people element of their management role. One manager said, "I was broken." And I quote, "You are less able to look after the needs of others. You need to put your own oxygen mask on first."
Yeah.
And similarly, another said, "I probably wasn't that interested in the well-being of my team because I was in survival mode." I think there's this expectation naturally of leaders and managers to steer their people towards the organizational visions and goals, and also to manage the engagement of their teams. But their own engagement and disengagement experiences are generally overlooked. Disengagement has the potential to be highly consequential, particularly in managers. The business case for it, I think, is fundamentally about the people. This proclivity to simplify it down to cause and effect, I think, has got to go. Our approach has got to become more sophisticated. Managers need to be more in tune with their people. And of course, that human connection is costly and it's less easy to package and perhaps to sell than talking about productivity and innovation and things. But I think that human connection within an organization is going to bring such great return on investment. Yeah.
That's just that's such an interesting point, even on your point there on the obsession with cause and effect, because we've had academics here discussing that is the only thing that should be looked at. How does that whole world work together? Because that's like how some people see from an outside world, that's how they see academia. That's the job, like to say, if this happens here, that happens, and that's fact, and then we can all learn from that. But you're talking about a more holistic approach. Can you just shed a little bit of light on that and just bring us into your thinking there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's all about absolutely acknowledging the power of stats and the power that we can't do without in quantitative research, while also being more inviting of qualitative approaches, which are so important if we are to understand the how and the sort of flesh that is needed to be put on those bones, really. And within academia, there is an increasing number of papers that do qualitative research. And I think the doors are opening, and that needs to be happening in business too. We need to be confident about not just presenting stats in meetings, but also talking about the how and providing the qualitative evidence.
Yeah, that's really useful to just to be brought into that and to start that conversation. And Siobhan, leaders that are listening, that people we always get feedback. People like a takeaway one thing. What does your evidence suggest would have the biggest positive impact on this subject? If a leader's listening, what's one thing they could go and do tomorrow or do this year?
Yeah, I think we need to alter our perspective and we need to be taking a more nuanced view on disengagement. Leaders need to abandon this kind of broad brush view that simplifies engagement as good and disengagement as bad, and therefore dismisses disengagement as a problem within their people that needs to be dealt with. Managers need to be more self-aware and understand their personal impact on organizational conditions, and crucially to avoid the overinterpretation of low engagement scores. Disengagement isn't a pathology, it's not a disease. It is a choice relating to feelings of vulnerability. And leaders need to invest in their managers, and managers need to reconnect with their people. That's what it all boils down to.
Love that. We're coming towards the final section now. Just three more questions to go. How can we build a culture where it's less likely for disengagement to take root, Siobhan?
Yeah, I think that I really want to stick to talking about the insights that have come from the data that we've collected and analyzed so far. And so, in terms of preventative stuff, the data that we did collect on prevention, we've put that aside because it was great depth as opposed to breadth that was required for the research at this doctoral level. But going back to our definition, disengagement is the emotionally laden, affective, and cognitive psychological experience of perceived vulnerability to one's personal self at work. So, preventing it is about understanding perceptions of work and the workplace and fundamentally understanding your people. It's that will give the insight into what could elicit feelings of vulnerability. So again, organizations need to invest in their managers so that they're more self-aware, more conscious of the conditions they create, and so that they better understand the value of connection. Again, it just all comes back to the people.
That's really useful. So I'm going to go away from the research for a second, and I'm not going to talk to the research. I'm just going to ask Dr. Siobhan Renshaw to ask a question, which is, as you look to the future, what do you think is going to be the biggest employee engagement challenge that we face in the next couple of years, Siobhan?
Yeah, I think that frankly, we need to change the conversation and get our heads in gear to face the challenge that is disengagement. And we need to be talking about it as what it really is. We need to recognize that existing approaches towards engagement are not working for disengagement. So we need to be questioning the current MO. And we need to progress beyond these flawed assumptions that are distorting our comprehension of it. Ultimately, that is recognizing that disengagement is not simply low engagement. It's not just the absence or shortage of what makes engagement. We need to start talking about disengagement in its own right as an independent construct. And that is a bit of a challenge in itself. But when we move beyond that safe sort of engagement space and we begin to grapple with the lesser known disengagement, as I said, we see that these traditional approaches aren't working. We can't expect to apply like engagement measures to measure disengagement, or to apply engagement interventions and expect it to have an impact necessarily on disengagement if the mechanisms in the two constructs are different. So there has to come this point, I think, where we reevaluate our thinking, we recognize the conflation of low engagement and disengagement, and we acknowledge that current approaches are not fit for purpose. So that's the conversation that my research advances. That is the challenge that the business world is faced with, really. And talk of what disengagement actually is already creeping up and the agenda into sort of wider consciousness. So it's only a matter of time, I think.
Yeah. Final thoughts, Siobhan. Our listeners, what's the one message that they want to use for them to take away from you today?
Yeah, I recognize that I am in this very privileged position of having had the luxury of diving in at the deepest level to explore this disengagement thing over a number of years. And I recognize that there's frustration in managers and leaders that nothing seems to work. But like I said, maybe that's because our vision of what's going on has been distorted. It's clouded when we try and view disengagement through the prism of engagement. But my research shines a light on disengagement itself, and it's been hiding in a blind spot behind the shadows of these other bigger constructs like engagement and burnout. So the bottom line is we're all human. We're all instinctually motivated to protect ourselves when we feel vulnerable, and people disengage for good reason. And those reasons and that disengagement needs to be understood because it's similar to what you said. It's rarely the fault of the seed if the plant doesn't grow.
Yeah.
Basically, leaders just need to invest in empowering their managers with a deeper understanding of what disengagement actually looks like in their organization, and they need to help them to approach it effectively. And they should be prepared to invest in professional support to help managers develop the tools and to acquire the skills to interpret those insights and to co-create the conditions most conducive to employee thriving.
I love that, Siobhan. My brain has had to work really hard to take all this in. We've covered so much ground. And I think if the listeners are feeling the same as I am, that there's a lot that's churning around in their heads now because some of this is really new and fresh. So just want to say on behalf of myself and the listeners, thank you for sharing this. I encourage all our listeners now to go and find gardeners and farmers and ask them and bring this conversation to them and get their views on it. But thank you. And I hope to have you back the next time there's another bit of research for you to share as well. Thank you, Siobhan.
Thank you so much, Matt.